Every 30 hours last year, a new billionaire was created. Compare that to every 33 hours, 1 million people fell into extreme poverty. Now, this is as per Oxfam Davos report. And while that was happening, wealth concentrated and poverty deepened. Over 120 million people were forcibly displaced from their homes. Again, these are data from UNHCR 2024. They've been displaced by war, climate collapse, political instability, and economic breakdown. They've been fleeing bombs, droughts, and collapsing infrastructure. They've been crossing borders, they've been waiting in camps, and they've been navigating very hostile asylum system in the Western world. While all this was happening, the governments in the host country, they have been debating. Corporations in a parallel world, they've continued to protect the shareholder value, and some would argue rightly so. But the world largely has moved on. So you wonder who has stepped in to help these displaced individuals survive? The answer is very disappointing. Often they themselves have. Not because they wanted to, but because they had to. So when systems fail, what do these people do? What do these group of people or community do? They improvise. And while displacement continues across borders, across generations, across oceans, we as a society have stayed focused on symptoms, not causes. And those of us privileged enough to worry about work-life balance rarely ask why this keeps happening to millions of others. We rarely confront the political, economic, and environmental forces that keeps making these individuals move. We have normalized it. We have adapted to it, and somehow we expect them to adapt too. Which brings me to where I want to start today. I want to start today with a long chain of political decisions, economic extraction, and systemic neglect that has left these people with no other option but to build something, anything at all, just to survive. Now, before we talk about how displaced people become entrepreneurs, we need to ask, why were they displaced in the first place? And let's call what it is. What I refer to them as displacement by design. Because if you look at it, wars do not erupt in vacuum. They don't appear overnight as isolated human tragedies. They are funded, they are sustained, and more often than not, they are fought over resources, territory, and geopolitical control. According to IDMC, over 75% of the conflict-driven displacement since 2010 has been linked to resource-rich regions or areas of strategic interest. I'll give you some examples. In Sudan, battles over oil fields continue to push families out of their homes. In Democratic Republic of Congo, millions are displaced as militias fight for control over minerals like coltan and cobalt, which, by the way, are essential for smartphones and electric cars many of us use on a day-to-day basis. In Syria, again, years of drought, amplified by climate inaction, has destabilized rural economies long before first shot of the civil war were fired. And more recently, the Ukraine-Russia war, which had displaced around 14 million people. disrupting not just human lives, but also global grain, commodity, and supply chain. In Gaza, since October 23, almost 1.7 million people, close to 2 million, I would say, have been displaced amid ongoing bombardment and destruction of civil infrastructure. And on top of that, you've got the climate-related disasters, which has displaced around 32 million people globally, with most of these happening in low and middle income countries, which has the least adaptive infrastructure. Again, this is not me telling you, this is IDMC Global Report on Internal Displacement. Meanwhile, military spending has hit 2.7 trillion in 2024, the highest on record, up 9.4% from the year before. And at the 2025 NATO summit, which was just concluded, member states have agreed to raise defense spending to 5% of the GDP by 2035. While the humanitarian budgets remain chronically underfunded year after year, you have seen an increase in the military spending. So isn't it what we call as displacement by design? So displacement overall isn't a policy failure. It's a predictable output of how the global economy operates. A world that prioritizes extraction over stability, control over care, and defense budgets over human security. This is a devastating reality. Today, over 1 billion people, they live in informal settlement. And more than 120 million people, they remain displaced without security or stability. So displacement, what I want to say, is not a tragic accident. It's a predictable outcome of political choices and economic priorities. And after being forced to move, individuals are handed one very quiet message, and that is, find your own way. Find your own way. That's what they're told, or the message they get very subtly. And that's where entrepreneurship enters the story. Not as a choice, but as the only available response to these individuals. The data tells you that refugees and migrants, they are 1.5 times more likely to become entrepreneurs than the host population, as per the OECD. But let's be clear, they're not doing this because they've discovered a passion for business. They're doing it because formal employment for them and these group of individuals is inaccessible. When it comes to social welfare, it's very limited. And also because humanitarian aid for them dries up within months. And that's where survival demands action. I'll take you to Gaza, which is under blockade for 17 years. Entrepreneurs there, they have created solar panel installation businesses just to keep the lights on. And they've turned to hydroponic and rooftop farming when land has become inaccessible. And some are surviving as remote freelancer, designers, developers, writers. They work in around power cuts and internet blackouts to earn global markets. Again, you go across to West Bank inside refugee camp like Balata and Jenin, entrepreneurship looks like bricolage, where they're using scraps, borrowed spaces, and community labor. Carpentry workshops in converted garages, embroidery collectives producing goods for local market. And your street vendors with mobile tea and coffee cars pushed out each morning just to make the day's wage. You cross over to Lebanon in Palestinian refugee camps, where decades of legal restrictions have blocked Palestinians from over 30 job categories. People have built informal micro businesses inside camps themselves. There are home-based catering services, tailoring shops, mobile phone repairs, and small grocery stalls, all operating with no legal protection or formal access. Again, these are data from UNRWA and ILO. Now we go to Kenya in Kakuma refugee camp. What began as a humanitarian shelter has evolved into a dense, informal entrepreneurial economy. Over 3,000 small businesses now operate inside that camp. Like for barber shops, second-hand clothing stores, small restaurants, informal transport services, all built from necessity with no formal access to banking or credit system. Even in wealthy nations, in Germany, for example, among Syrian refugees who arrived post-2015, nearly 20% are now self-employed, launching food businesses, home-based salons, cleaning services, small transport companies, often in response to employment discrimination and limited access to formal job market. These data coming from German Institute of Economic Research. So when you look at all of these aren't passion projects. They aren't built for scale. They are built for survival, for stability for themselves. And again, if you look at the human side of it, it's about dignity when every other system has failed them. So this isn't entrepreneurial ambition. It's entrepreneurial survival. Now, amidst all of this, you wonder, what is the institutional response? Is it adaptation, moving away from accountability? But there are some institutions, they are stepping in slowly, often reluctantly, and they're always almost underfunded. Not because they are empowered to drive a systemic change, but because they're the last safety net where the state responsibility has completely eroded. And I'm talking about NGOs, social enterprises, community organizations. They now find themselves doing the work that governments have quietly and in many cases deliberately stepped away from. So for these organizations, they're not by choice, but because political establishments across left, right, and center has made refugee and migrant support politically inconvenient. So when you hear the narrative these days, welfare-based solutions, they've become very, very toxic. It has entered a toxic territory. It has become too polarized for a public discourse or debate. Again, too risky for election campaigns. Too expensive for austerity budgets. And let's be honest, too low on the list of priorities for government, more focused on GDP targets and media optics. And the data suggests that since 2020, 26 of the 32 OECD countries have introduced new border restrictions, asylum deterrence policies, and welfare cuts, which are targeting displaced population, regardless of political ideology. These numbers are supported by Migration Policy Institute 2024. Now, this isn't an accidental drift. It's a design, a bipartisan, cross-ideological retreat from responsibility. And so we see the same global pattern emerge from state responsibility to charity to market-based solutions. Refugee and migrants are no longer framed as people fleeing violence or collapse. They are cast as economic burdens, security threats, or potential entrepreneurs, which is celebrated, whose survival is now their own personal responsibility. Human Rights Watch reports that over 70 countries have criminalized aspect of refugee movement. 70 countries criminalizing aspects of refugee movement or undocumented migration since 2021. So when it comes to institutions, they adapt. They roll out microfinance schemes. You see NGOs, they're running entrepreneurship training in camps. You have consultants producing glossy impact report. They are filled with languages like self-reliance pathway. And if that doesn't suffice, we also hear about refugee economic empowerment. Now, amidst all of this, there are moments of hope. They are very small, but there are meaningful shifts. Institutions like Spark, they've been working across Middle East and Africa. They've started embedding context-sensitive entrepreneurship training programs that go beyond business models and focus on resilience, mental health, and community rebuilding. Programs like Refugee Investment Network, they are advocating for ethical movement in refugee-led businesses, pushing back against purely profit-driven funding models. We have academic initiatives like Oxford Refugee-led Research Hub. They are working to put displaced voices at the center of entrepreneurship research and training. And here in the UK, projects like Serious Policy Network, they have begun reframing migrant entrepreneurship as a policy and social inclusion issue, not just as a labor market statistics. Now, when you look at all of these aren't perfect solutions. They are often underfunded and undersupported. But they do reflect something very important. A growing recognition that entrepreneurship in displacement context isn't just economic output. Isn't just about the economic value. It's about the social repair. But still, for every one of these programs, there are dozens more replicating the same market-based logic, treating displaced people as untapped economic units rather than humans surviving layered and structural violence. And while some of these institutional work creates real opportunity, none of it addresses the harder question, which is, why do people move? Why are they displaced? So now let's turn our lens back on education and research, which is where I come from, where I stand guilty too. Because if you look at most of the business schools, entrepreneurship is still taught as a growth strategy, a roadmap to investment, a way to deliver shareholder value. We train students to build pitch decks, map revenue models, and calculate return on investment. But we rarely ask them to consider what entrepreneurship looks like when your home is a tent, your market is a refugee camp, and your business plan is simply about surviving the next week. In research, focus continues to drift towards digital transformation, AI-driven business models, and scalable tech ventures. And again, I'll give you some data around it. A review of entrepreneurship publication in leading journals showed that over 65% of the recently published paper, they focused on AI integration. And I'm being very conservative with these numbers. They focused on AI integration, digital platforms, and tech-enabled scalability, while fewer than 2%, less than 2% addressed refugee, migrant, or crisis-driven entrepreneurship context. Again, as academics, we chase journal rankings where our work could be published. We align with funder priorities, and we tick that innovation boxes. And in doing so, we erase the entrepreneurs already doing the hard work. Without recognition, without funding, without a place in our syllabus or journals. Now, when displacement appears in our research at all, if it does, it is often sanitized through policy funding. Languages like unlocking economic potential in emerging markets or leveraging refugee entrepreneurship in labor market integration. But this silence isn't absolute. There are voices, quiet but growing, that are challenging this narrative. You have likes of University of Oxford, their refugee-led research hub. Again, it centers displaced voices, not just as research subjects, but as co-researchers and knowledge producers. I could take you to Deusto Business School in Spain. It focuses on humanitarian entrepreneurship in conflict and post-disaster setting, framing enterprise as a social survival, not just as the economic mechanism. Universities in Finland have produced groundbreaking research, where some of my research is also ongoing, on refugee entrepreneurship and mixed embeddedness, exploring how institutional barriers intersect with migrant strategies. I've already told you about UK's Serious project, which provides insight into how migrants navigate labor market, including their exclusion and including entrepreneurship as a forced choice. Scholars, they continue to interrogate migration, forced displacement, and entrepreneurship with critical, socially engaged lens. And that's the part of why I started this podcast. It contributes to a collective shift. It amplifies existing work and bringing it from academic journals into public conversation. Because I strongly believe if we don't teach, research, and fund entrepreneurship where crisis happens, we will keep leaving the people out doing the hardest work. Often they're unseen, they're unsupported, and they're unheard at all. Now, there's a cost of turning some of those survival into success stories. And this is where the danger really shows. When we frame refugee and migrant entrepreneurs as success stories, without context, without structural analysis, we do more than just overlook their complexity. We actively participate in rewriting systemic failures as individual triumph. We turn trauma into sound bites, we turn resilience into a performance, and we celebrate human adaptability without ever asking why people were forced to adapt in the first place. We are seeing incubators for refugee businesses. But we ignore the policies, the wars, and the economic sanctions that have caused their displacement. Again, we teach students how to develop business models, But we rarely ask them to develop critical models of political and economic system that made entrepreneurship a survival mechanism. We feature refugee founders on conference panels. Again, these are celebrated. At the same time, we see the welfare state shrinking. Resettlement quota, which have stagnated over the years, and the government step even further back from their responsibilities. Now, this is at the cost of ignoring the root cause. We let the burden of survival fall on those least resourced or equipped to carry it. And then we applaud them for carrying it well, at least some of them. And when we turn this necessity-driven entrepreneurship into a curated success stories, we let everyone off the hook. Government, funders, policymakers, even researchers like me. We let the systems reframe survival as innovation. When the most displaced entrepreneurs, for them, that's the left. So we have to have a moral reset, and which is what I call de-economizing entrepreneurship. And this is the structural consequence of turning survival into success stories. When we celebrate refugee entrepreneurs without addressing the root cause, when we measure the success in sales figure and scalability, we participate in what researchers call the marketisation of displacement. We turn migration into a labor market input. We turn crisis into entrepreneurial pipelines. A report in 2023 by UNDP, it found that over 70% of refugee livelihood programs they funded globally in the past 5 years were tied to entrepreneurship and self-employment, while less than 10% were focused on direct income support or social welfare. So this is not just a funding trend. This is about the moral drift. And this brings me to the core theme of this podcast. The reason builders of Broken Bazaar exists at all. We need to de-economize entrepreneurship, especially in the context of displacement and crisis. So let me tell you what de-economizing of entrepreneurship means. It means refusing to evaluate success stories purely based on revenue growth or scalability. It means asking better questions. Did this business help restore dignity? Did it offer stability in the absence of state support? Again, did it build community resilience? Not just individual profit, which we are all so fixated on. So it basically means understanding that for displaced people, entrepreneurship is often the last resort, not a strategic career choice, not a startup dream, not an economic opportunity, but a daily act of survival. And for those of us in the classroom, in the research center, in funding bodies and policy circles, it means confronting our complicity. Our complicity in framing entrepreneurship as the solution, without ever questioning why the crisis exists in the first place. So we need to stop asking, how do we make displaced people more entrepreneurial? And start asking, why have we made survival a private entrepreneurial burden at all? Because if we don't shift that narrative, we will keep romanticizing struggle. We will keep applauding resilience. and will keep ignoring the structural violence that made entrepreneurship necessary in that first place. So, before we celebrate resilience, before we romanticize migrant businesses, before we frame necessity driven entrepreneurship as a solution to displacement, let's pause and really, together as a society, confront the harder truth that behind every refugee run business, behind every camp based tailoring business, and behind every informal logistic hustle, there is a system that has failed, a set of policies that shifted responsibility from the state to the individual, a global economy that continues to outsource survival into the displaced and then call it entrepreneurship. So, next time I'll be speaking with someone working inside these institutional support ecosystem to unpack what real ethical support looks like without perpetuating the very harm it's trying to solve. Until then, I'm Dr. Tabish Saman, and this is the Builders of the Broken Bazaar. Thank you for listening.